The first sign of Julian Thorne's arrival wasn't the whisper of his $1,000 Brioni shoes on the marble floor, nor the synchronized parting of the dinner guests as if cleaved by an invisible prow. It was the sudden, palpable drop in the room's temperature, a thermodynamic impossibility that defied the carefully calibrated climate control of the Serafina Grand's opulent dining hall. A predatory chill snaked between the tables, silencing the clinking of silverware and muting the murmur of conversation. It was a silence that fell not out of respect, but out of a primal, instinctual fear. This was a man who didn't just occupy a space. He conquered it, terraforming the emotional landscape to suit his own frigid nature. Elara Vance felt the change from her station behind the polished mahogany service bar, her fingers methodically polishing a Rydell wine glass that was already as immaculate as a lens for a telescope. For 5 years, this had been her world. A gilded cage of shimmering crystal, hushed negotiations, and the transient, often cruel, whims of New York City's financial royalty. At 29, she was a ghost in a crisp black uniform, an intelligent, perceptive woman rendered invisible by her role. Her art history degree, earned with scholarships and grueling part-time jobs, was now a bittersweet memory, gathering dust in a cramped Queens apartment. That dream had been sacrificed, piece by painful piece, to the crushing, soul-grinding weight of her late mother's failed battle with a merciless illness and the mountain of medical debt it had left in its wake. All that remained of that life, of that vibrant, paint-splattered girl who could discourse for hours on the emotional resonance of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, was a small, silver locket she wore tucked beneath her collar. Its cool weight against her sternum was a constant, grounding pressure, a memento mori of a life of passion now sublimated into a life of service. She was a creature of intense observation, a skill honed not in the quiet lecture halls of Columbia, but in the unforgiving, high-stakes theater of high-end service. It was, in a way, a continuation of her art studies. She learned to read the subtle language of the human form under pressure. She could diagnose the subtle tick of a jaw that signaled an imminent complaint about the wine temperature before it was voiced. She could interpret the furtive flicker of a gaze between a CEO and his assistant that betrayed a clandestine, ruinous affair. She could see the almost imperceptible tremor in a hedge fund manager's hand as he signed the check, revealing a deal that had gone catastrophically south that afternoon. She saw the desperation lurking behind the diamond-cuffed wrists, the profound, echoing hollowness behind the boisterous bravado. Her job was to serve food, but her reality was to manage the fragile egos of the powerful. And tonight, as on most Tuesdays and Thursdays, her quietest moments of solace were centered on a single patron. The elderly man seated alone at table 12, a Mr. Arthur Pendleton. He was her regular, a kind, unassuming man with watery blue eyes, a nimbus of wispy white hair, and a tweed jacket that had seen better decades. He was an anachronism, an island of quiet dignity in an ocean of loud, performative entitlement. He always ordered the seared scallops, no appetizer, no dessert. He read a well-worn book of poetry. Tonight, it was Seamus Heaney, and left a tip that was precisely, almost mathematically, 20% of the pre-tax bill. He spoke to her with a gentle courtesy that felt almost alien in this environment, asking about her evening as if he genuinely cared about the answer. Tonight, She had noticed the slight slump in his shoulders was more pronounced than usual. A deep weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. When she refilled his water, she had paused. "Is everything all right, Mr. Pendleton?" she had asked softly. He had looked up from his book, his eyes focusing on her as if from a great distance. "Just the weight of the world, my dear," he'd answered with a sad, wry smile. "It seems to get heavier with each passing year." He then glanced around the dining hall at the boisterous tables of bankers and brokers. "Sometimes I look at what we build, and I wonder if we've forgotten the foundations." It was a strangely profound comment for their usual light conversation. She had offered him a warm, genuine smile. "Well, for what it's worth, you're one of the foundations of my week, sir. It's always a pleasure to see you." He had returned the smile, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, a gratitude so profound it felt entirely out of proportion to her simple courtesy. It was a small moment of genuine human connection, the kind of untaxable income that made the job bearable. Then the chill arrived. Julian Thorne and his retinue of 3 sycophants, a lean, nervous lawyer, a brash young tech analyst, and a severe-looking woman with a tablet settled into the restaurant's prime alcove. It was less a table and more a throne room for the evening. Thorne himself was a masterpiece of cold, corporate perfection. His suit was a slash of midnight Zegna silk, his face a sculpture of harsh, unforgiving angles, and a bone-deep, bored disdain. On his French cuffs, 2 large, square-cut onyx stones gleamed like frozen pools of oil, absorbing all the warm, ambient light of the chandeliers and giving absolutely none of it back. He didn't look at the menu. He looked through it, his gaze dismissing the culinary artistry within as irrelevant. He didn't speak to the staff. He issued decrees to the air, expecting them to be obeyed. His gaze, the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, swept the room with the casual arrogance of a king surveying his feasting hall. It snagged on Alara for a brief, invasive moment. She felt the assessment, a swift, brutal categorization that stripped her of her humanity. Insignificant. Furniture. Female. Part of the scenery. He then turned his attention back to his companions, and the performance began. He held court, his voice a low, confident purr that, despite its volume, seemed to carry through the entire dining room, dissecting a rival technology company with the detached, surgical precision of a vivisectionist. The words were slick with venom and power, describing a hostile takeover not as a business transaction, but as a hunt, a culling of the weak. "We bleed them out slowly," Thorne was saying, a thin, cruel smile gracing his lips as he gestured with a silver fork. "It's not about the initial offer. That's amateur hour. It's about perception. We leak a rumor to the Journal about a flaw in their flagship product. We hire a proxy firm to challenge their board nominations. We poach their 3 top engineers in 1 week. We cut off their supply lines, poison their credit rating with the banks, and when they're on the floor, gasping for air and bleeding capital, we don't buy them. We simply step on their throat and take their assets for pennies on the dollar." His associates laughed, a chorus of brittle, nervous sounds from people desperate to remain in the predator's good graces. Alara's stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. It was the casual, unadorned cruelty that got to her, the utter sociopathic lack of empathy. It was the same systemic indifference she had seen in the eyes of the insurance executives who had classified her mother's last hope experimental treatment as non-essential. It was the same sterile dismissal she had heard in the voices of the bankers who had foreclosed on her family home with boilerplate apologies. It was the language of a world that saw people not as flesh and blood, but as liabilities, as obstacles on a spreadsheet, as things to be removed. The general manager, a perpetually sweating man named Mr. Davies, hovered near Thorne's table like a nervous moth drawn to a merciless flame. His entire posture was an apology for his own existence. He fussed, he fawned, he refilled Thorne's champagne glass before it was even half empty, his movements jerky, with a desperate, cloying need to please. The meal progressed, a symphony of arrogance and servility. Then, the moment came that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. Thorne, having finished his main course of Wagyu beef, pushed his plate away with a faint look of disgust, as if the perfectly prepared, ruinously expensive cut of meat had personally offended him. He wanted dessert. He didn't need to consult the menu. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't make eye contact with the ever-present Davies. He didn't utter a single word. He simply lifted his right hand, the one with the heavy gold signet ring, poised it in the air with theatrical deliberation, and snapped his fingers. Snap. The sound was sharp, ugly, and obscenely imperious. It cut through the sophisticated murmur of the restaurant like a whip crack. Every head in the room turned. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. In that single, explosive, contemptuous sound was a summation of his entire being, his entire worldview. I am Julian Thorne. The world is my instrument. You are nothing. Come to me. Mr. Davies practically tripped over his own feet, rushing to the table, his face a mask of panicked eagerness. But Thorne's cold eyes weren't on him. They were locked on Alara, who stood frozen 20 feet away by the service station. It was a clear, deliberate, public summons, a command, an assertion of dominance for the sheer, vulgar sport of it. He was demonstrating his power by commanding the most distant, insignificant person he could find. Something inside Alara, a chord of self-respect that had been stretched taut for 5 years by 1,000 small humiliations, 1,000 moments of being treated as less than, 1,000 swallowed insults, finally broke. The image of her mother's tired, proud face flashed in her mind. The feel of the cold silver locket against her skin, a reminder of who she was meant to be. The gentle, weary eyes of Mr. Pendleton across the room, a man who represented a different, quieter kind of strength. It all coalesced into a single point of white-hot, crystalline clarity. She began to walk, not with the hurried, apologetic scuttle of a servant, but with a slow, deliberate, almost regal grace. The clack of her sensible, worn-out shoes on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous, suddenly silent room. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, but she saw only one man. As she reached the table, the air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like static electricity. Thorne smirked, a cruel, triumphant curl of his lip. He was expecting her to bow her head, to whisper, "Yes, sir?" to validate his power and complete his public demonstration. Alara stopped directly in front of him, her posture ramrod straight, her shoulders back. She met his glacial gaze and held it. Her own eyes, usually a soft, warm hazel, now glinting like chips of flint. She didn't speak. She didn't ask what he wanted. She simply waited for a beat, letting the silence stretch, letting his smirk begin to falter. Then she lifted her own hand, held it at the same height as his had been, and mirrored his gesture with perfect, sharp precision. Snap. Her snap was just as loud, just as sharp, just as commanding. It was a perfect, defiant, shocking echo. The shock on Julian Thorne's face was a thing of rare and beautiful artistry, a web of fine cracks appearing in a marble facade of arrogance. His smirk dissolved, replaced by a wave of stunned, uncomprehending disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure, undiluted fury. The blood rose in his neck, a tide of crimson against the expensive white of his collar. In the ringing, absolute silence, Alara finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was low, clear, and steady, carrying the resonant weight of every indignity she had ever swallowed. "In America, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone as cool and polished as the silverware she spent her days cleaning, "we do not snap our fingers at people as if they are dogs. We are a nation built on ideals of respect, however poorly we sometimes practice them. Here, in this establishment, we use our words. We ask. We do not command. Now." She paused, letting the lesson hang in the air for a moment longer. "How may I help you?" The silence that followed was profound, a vacuum in which an entire universe of social order had just been inverted. It was the sound of an entire room holding its collective breath. It was the sound of a billionaire's ego, so vast and inflated it had its own gravitational pull, being expertly and publicly punctured by the quiet, unyielding dignity of a waitress. His face, a moment ago a mask of arrogant control, was now a canvas of raw, sputtering, impotent rage. For the first time, perhaps in his entire adult life, Julian Thorne was utterly speechless. He had been challenged, diminished, and corrected, not by a corporate rival in a boardroom or a hostile shareholder, but by a woman in a uniform he wouldn't have bothered to notice otherwise. And in the corner of her eye, a detail that would later prove to be the most important of the night, Alara saw Mr. Pendleton, the unassuming old man at table 12. He had lowered his book of poetry to the table. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, and his watery blue eyes, now fixed on her, held a glint of something she had never seen there before. Sharp, analytical, and deeply, profoundly impressed. The immediate aftermath was a blur of tightly controlled chaos. Julian Thorne's face cycled through a spectrum of outrage, from the bleached white of pure shock to a choleric, blotchy red that suggested an imminent aneurysm. Words, thick and clumsy with unaccustomed fury, finally tumbled from his lips. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he hissed. The question was a weapon, honed over years of use, intended to make her flinch, to make her crumble, to remind her of her place in the food chain. Alara didn't move, didn't even blink. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Thorne. You're a guest in this restaurant, and I am a member of the staff. My name is Alara, and I will not be summoned like an animal." "You're fired," he roared, the sound unnaturally loud in the still silent room. He slammed a fist on the table, making the crystal tremble violently. "Davies, get this thing out of my sight. I want her name, her social security number. She'll never work in this city again, not even as a dishwasher. I will personally see to it." Mr. Davies, his face the color of spoiled milk, scurried forward, wringing his hands so hard his knuckles were white. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I am so sorry. 1,000 apologies. This is an unacceptable, an inexcusable breach of protocol." He turned on Alara, his own terror transmuting into a pathetic, second-hand rage. "Vance. Office. Now. You are finished. Out." As Thorne's sycophants began to murmur their support, creating a protective wall of noise around their wounded king, he regained a sliver of his icy composure. He straightened his tie with a vicious tug and sneered at Alara, a look of utter, dismissive contempt. "Enjoy the unemployment line. I own people like you." He made a grand show of standing, of gathering his things, as if the very air around the table had been contaminated. In his haste and anger, as he snatched his sleek, platinum briefcase from the adjacent chair, a thin, impossibly elegant pen slipped from an exterior pocket. It was matte black, with a single silver band, and it rolled silently and unnoticed under the table, coming to a stop near Ilara's foot. No one, in the flurry of their dramatic, huffy exit, noticed the small, metallic object falling into the shadows. Ilara turned to leave, her own heart hammering a frantic, delayed rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He was right. He was powerful enough to destroy her life with a single phone call. But as she took a step, her shoe brushed against the pen. On pure, unthinking instinct, she bent down, her movements fluid and unnoticed in the commotion, and scooped it up. It felt strangely heavy in her palm, dense and cold, its balance perfect. She slipped it into her apron pocket just as Davies grabbed her arm, his fleshy fingers digging into her bicep with surprising force. "You have no idea the damage you've done," he whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and sheer terror. In his cramped, paper-strewn office, reeking of stale coffee and desperation, Davies didn't even let her sit. He paced like a caged animal while she stood before his desk. "Suspended!" "Indefinitely. Without pay, of course. I have to report this to corporate. Do you understand? Julian Thorne is on the board of Nexus Holdings, the parent company that owns this entire hotel chain. You didn't just insult a customer, you spat in the eye of God." Ilara remained silent, her mind reeling. The weight of the pen in her pocket was a strange, solid anchor in the storm of her imploding reality. She was summarily dismissed, forced to collect her few personal belongings from a locker in the staff basement. Her exit a walk of shame past the sympathetic but frightened, downcast eyes of her fellow staff. The cold night air of the city hit her like a slap. The glittering, indifferent lights of the Manhattan skyline, which had once seemed so full of promise, now felt mocking. She was jobless, with rent due in a week, and a black mark against her name that a man like Thorne would undoubtedly ensure was indelible. Her apartment was small, the air thick with the faint, ghostly scent of turpentine from her long abandoned canvases, which stood facing the wall like scolded children. She sank onto her lumpy sofa, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a hollow, vibrating ache. She pulled the pen from her pocket and looked at it under the dim light of her lamp. It was a thing of minimalist, expensive beauty, a marvel of engineering. She twisted the base, expecting the nib of a fountain pen to appear. Instead, the two halves separated with a soft, satisfying, metallic click. It wasn't a pen. The top half housed a tiny, sophisticated microphone grill. The bottom half was a solid-state USB drive. Her breath hitched. This was not a writing instrument. This was a tool for espionage, a bug, a dead drop. With trembling hands, she plugged the drive into her old, sputtering laptop. The computer whirred in protest before recognizing the device. A single folder appeared on the screen, labeled with a single cryptic word: Lazarus. Her curiosity, a force stronger even than her fear, compelled her to click it. Inside were dozens of audio files, time-stamped, and a few heavily encrypted documents. She clicked on the most recent audio file. The quality was astonishingly, terrifyingly clear. Thorne's voice filled her small apartment, the same low, confident purr she'd heard in the restaurant. The saint. Jude's foundation is the perfect washing machine, Thorne was saying to an unidentified man with a slight European accent. The funds come in as large, untraceable charitable donations from our offshore entities in Panama, get funneled through the Serafina's massively inflated catering and event invoices. Davies is handling the creative accounting on his end and come out clean on the other side. By the time it's used for the acquisition of sterling coal, it's as pure as driven snow. There was more. Talk of kickbacks, of falsified supply chain ledgers, of a final payout, and data wipe scheduled in 3 days, coinciding with the annual St. Jude's Hospital Foundation Gala. They weren't just bleeding a rival company. They were using a beloved children's hospital charity as a front, and the Serafina Grand, her workplace, as the central hub for a massive money laundering and corporate sabotage scheme. Mr. Davies wasn't just a sycophant. He was a willing, integral accomplice. A mini-reveal that hit her like a physical blow. Her manager, the man who had just fired her for defending her own dignity, was a serious criminal. Suddenly, a knock echoed on her apartment door. Sharp. Insistent. 2 quick raps. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. They had found her. Thorne must have realized the pen was missing. He had sent someone. Her mind raced, cataloging escape routes. The fire escape outside her kitchen window. The roof access. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, calm and surprisingly familiar. "Miss Vance?" "Elara?" "It's Arthur Pendleton, from Table 12. Please, I just want to talk. It's important." Hesitantly, cautiously, she opened the door a crack, leaving the chain on. The elderly man stood in the dimly lit hallway, his kind face etched with concern. But his eyes, those watery blue eyes, were different now. They were sharp, intelligent, and held no trace of the gentle, poetic confusion she was used to. He looked like a hawk who had been pretending to be a sparrow. "May I come in?" he asked. his voice low but firm. "I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Mr. Thorne. And I have a strong suspicion you may have found something that belongs to him." His gaze flicked down for a fraction of a second towards her apron, which she had thrown over a chair, the pocket where the pen had been. He knew. He must have seen her pick it up. Letting him in was a monumental risk, but her finely tuned intuition, the same instinct that had told her to confront Thorne, now screamed that this was a risk she had to take. She unlatched the chain and opened the door. He stepped inside, his eyes taking in the small apartment in a single, sweeping glance, finally resting on the laptop, which was still glowing with the incriminating file directory. He didn't seem surprised in the slightest. "Lazarus," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "So, the rumors were true." "Who are you?" Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question feeling absurdly inadequate. He gave a wry, sad smile, the gentle old man persona returning for a moment, but now it seemed like a well-worn coat he could take on and off at will. "I'm the man who started the Serafina Hospitality Group 50 years ago, with a single dusty motel in Arizona and a belief that hospitality was about affording people dignity. Julian Thorne sits on my board because he strong-armed his way there with a minority share acquisition 3 years ago. And for the past 6 months, I've been quietly investigating where millions of dollars in profits from my flagship properties have been disappearing. I've been visiting my own hotels, not as the founder, but as a ghost, watching, listening." The revelation was staggering, a plot twist from a movie she had suddenly been cast in. Her kind, unassuming, regular, the poetry-reading old man was Arthur Pendleton, the reclusive, almost mythical founder of the entire empire. He was the undercover power she couldn't have even dreamed of. The foundation she thought he was talking about wasn't an abstract concept. It was his own life's work. "Tonight," Arthur continued, his voice hardening, losing its elderly tremor and gaining a core of steel, "I saw 2 things. The first was the unabashed, arrogant corruption I've long suspected, embodied by Thorne and his pathetic creature, Davies. The second," he paused and looked at her, truly looked at her. And for the first time since her mother died, she felt seen not for her function, but for her character. "The second was an act of courage and integrity I haven't witnessed in a very long time. Your courage, Miss Vance." He nodded toward the laptop. "That pen is a custom-made recording device and encrypted data vault. Thorne is arrogant, but not stupidly so. He keeps his most sensitive operational data on his person, shielded from hackers and corporate espionage. He must be apoplectic right now, realizing it's gone. They will be looking for it, and they will be looking for you." The full, terrifying weight of the situation crashed down on Elara. This was no longer about a lost job and a bruised ego. This was about corporate espionage, millions upon millions of dollars, and a ruthless man who had casually and gleefully talked about stepping on people's throats. "What do we do?" she asked, the "we" hanging in the air, a fragile, tentative bridge between 2 of the most unlikely allies in the city. Arthur's eyes gleamed with a righteous, long, dormant fire. "Julian Thorne wanted to make an example of you, my dear. I think it's time we returned the favor. We have 3 days until his final payout at the gala. 3 days to get everything we need. We are going to dismantle his entire parasitic operation from the inside out. But I can't do it alone. I have the resources, the network, the access from the top down. But you have the key. You have the ground-level truth. You know the terrain, the staff, their routines, their fears, their secrets. You're not a ghost in that hotel, Alara. You're the one person who has been invisible enough to see everything. He held out his hand, his grip surprisingly firm and steady. Will you help me take back my company and deliver a little long overdue justice along the way? Alara looked at the hand of the powerful, decent man who had seen her worth when she was at her lowest. She looked at her laptop screen, at the digital proof of a deep and festering corruption that poisoned everything it touched. She thought of Thorne's snap, a sound that represented a system that chewed up and spat out good people like her and her mother. This was a chance not just to save herself, but to tear down that system, to hold the powerful accountable. This was a chance to fight back. She took his hand. Yes, she said, her voice firm and clear. Let's give Mr. Thorne a night he'll never forget. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in clandestine operations, orchestrated from the unlikely command center of Alara's cramped Queen's apartment. The space was transformed. Arthur produced a set of burner phones and a high-end laptop with secured network access. Her coffee table became a war room desk, covered in hotel blueprints he'd procured from his contacts in facilities management. Arthur Pendleton, in turn, was a revelation. The gentle, bookish facade fell away completely to reveal a brilliant, ruthless strategist with a network of loyalists cultivated over a 50-year career. His first call was to a woman named Evelyn Reed, his former head of corporate security, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s who had been forced into early retirement by Thorne's new appointees. She arrived within the hour, dressed not as a security expert, but as a high-end IT consultant carrying a sleek metal briefcase. Her eyes were like chips of ice, and she surveyed the scene with a practiced, analytical calm. The device is military grade, Evelyn confirmed after a tense hour of work, examining the pen drive on her own system. Triple-layer AES encryption. Thorne is paranoid. The audio files you accessed must have been on a temporary, unencrypted partition for quick review. A rare slip-up on his part, likely because he felt untouchable. The real prize, the Lazarus ledgers, the offshore account numbers, the list of co-conspirators, is locked down tight. Can you crack it? Arthur asked, his voice betraying a hint of tension. Evelyn cracked a grim smile. Does a bear defecate in the woods? Give me a day, a quiet room, and enough coffee to float a battleship. I'll get in. While Evelyn worked her digital magic, Arthur and Alara planned their attack on the physical world. The money laundering hinges on Davies falsifying the hotel's supply and event invoices, Arthur mused, pacing the small living room, his energy that of a man half his age. We need physical proof, something tangible that corroborates the digital records on that drive, something a jury can touch and see. This was where Alara's intimate, ground-level knowledge became their most potent weapon. The main accounting office is on the 3rd floor. Biometric locks, heavily monitored, she began, pointing to a spot on the blueprints. But Davies is arrogant. He keeps a shadow ledger. I've seen him with it. It's an old-school, leather-bound book where he reconciles his doctored numbers with the real ones. He keeps it in the bottom drawer of his office desk, the one he thinks is hidden behind the fake mahogany paneling. He's old-fashioned that way. He likes the feel of it. He trusts paper more than pixels. She knew more, painting a vivid picture of the hotel's secret ecosystem of fear and compromise. The night shift cleaning crew is run by a supervisor named Maria. Her son is a brilliant student, got a partial scholarship to NYU, but they can't cover the rest. Davies promised to put in a good word for a full ride from the saint. Jude's foundation. Thorne's sham charity, if she keeps her eyes shut about certain late-night deliveries to the kitchen, deliveries that never appear on any official inventory. Blackmail and leverage, Arthur murmured, his jaw tight. He's using a mother's hope for her son against her. The head chef, Antoine Dubois, is a good man, a brilliant chef, Elara continued. But his daughter has a rare autoimmune disorder. I've heard Davies remind him, ever so casually, how fortunate he is that the company's generous executive insurance plan covers the experimental treatments. Antoine has been signing off on food supply invoices that are inflated by at least 40%. He knows it's wrong, but he's trapped. Each detail she provided was a new thread in the web, a fresh breadcrumb on the trail. She knew which security cameras had blind spots because a lazy technician had installed them. She knew which night watchman on the 3rd floor, a man named Henderson, fell asleep in the security office between 2:15 and 3 a.m. every night. She knew whose loyalty could be bought not with money, but with the simple, powerful promise of a better, fairer system. They were mapping the conspiracy not with corporate charts, but with the human cost of Julian Thorne's insatiable greed. The plan they formulated was audacious, bordering on theatrical. They wouldn't just go to the authorities with the digital evidence Evelyn was working to decrypt. That could get tied up in legal battles, motions, and appeals for years. Thorne's lawyers would bury them in paperwork. They needed to orchestrate a public, undeniable, and utterly humiliating takedown. Thorne's final payout coincides with the annual Saint. Jude's Hospital Foundation Gala, Arthur said, a dangerous glint in his eye. It's the premier philanthropic event of the season, and it's being held, of course, at the Serafina. Thorne is this year's guest of honor. He's set to receive the Humanitarian of the Year award. The irony was so thick, so grotesque, Elara could have choked on it. He'll be there, preening for the cameras, bathing in fake adulation, Arthur continued. The mayor will be there. The district attorney will be there. Half the city's media will be there. It's the perfect stage for our final act. Their first move was to secure the shadow ledger. That very night, Elara, dressed in dark clothing, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, navigated the silent, ghost-filled halls of the hotel. Guided by Evelyn on a secure earpiece, she used a master service keycard Evelyn had remotely activated. The air, once familiar, now felt hostile, fraught with unseen danger. She slipped into Davies' office, the cloying smell of his cheap cologne still lingering like a guilty conscience. Just as she'd said, behind the cheap wood paneling was the hidden drawer. Inside, the heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was filled with neat columns of cooked numbers, a meticulous, handwritten record of years of fraud. As she was leaving, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Her blood ran cold. "Henderson is on his rounds." Evelyn's voice crackled in her ear. 10 seconds early tonight. Get in the supply closet. Now." Elara ducked into the dark, cramped closet, the smell of bleach and old mops filling her nostrils, and held her breath. The guard passed, whistling a slightly off-key pop song, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The close call left her trembling, but with the ledger clutched to her chest like a sacred text, she felt a surge of electrifying triumph. By the next morning, Evelyn had worked her miracle. She looked exhausted, but victorious. "I'm in," she announced, holding up a flash drive. "It's all here." A labyrinth of shell corporations, numbered accounts in the Caymans, a complete record of every single dollar laundered through the Foundation's accounts. He even has a list of city officials and inspectors on his private payroll. This Lazarus file isn't just a record of his crimes. It's the architectural blueprint of his entire corrupt empire. They now had the digital sword and the physical shield. The final piece was the human element. Arthur made 2 calls. The first was to Maria, the cleaning supervisor. He met her at a small diner downtown, with Elara by his side. He didn't threaten or cajole. He laid out the truth, and then made her a promise. A legally binding, fully funded scholarship for her son, and a promotion to head of housekeeping for the entire hotel, effective immediately. All she had to do was tell the truth. The tears of relief that streamed down the proud woman's face were more valuable than any evidence. The second meeting was with Chef Antoine in a quiet corner of Central Park. Arthur explained the situation and guaranteed, in writing, his daughter's medical care for life, personally underwritten by him from his private fortune. The proud, compromised chef broke down, his shoulders shaking with the release of years of pent-up fear and guilt. He agreed to provide a sworn affidavit and testify about the coercion and the inflated invoices. The night of the gala arrived. The grand ballroom of the Serafina Grand was a shimmering, almost blinding sea of diamonds, designer gowns, and champagne. Julian Thorne was at its absolute center, a dark star absorbing all the light and adoration. His onyx cufflinks gleaming under the magnificent crystal chandeliers. He was magnanimous, charming, the very picture of a benevolent billionaire, accepting praise with practiced humility. He hadn't seen Elara since that night, and if he thought of her at all, it was as a minor annoyance, a piece of trash that had been taken out and long forgotten. Elara was there, but she was invisible in a different way now. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue dress Arthur had provided, her hair pulled back in a severe professional knot. The silver locket was her only adornment. She stood in the wings of the grand stage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, a technician's pass clipped to her dress. Arthur, looking every bit the distinguished founder in a classic tuxedo, was by her side. Evelyn was in a nearby surveillance van parked on a side street, coordinating with a discreet team of federal agents from the SEC and the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. They were mingling among the guests, posing as hedge fund managers and society doyens, their expressions bland, their eyes missing nothing. The ceremony began. Speeches were made, praising Thorne's fictional generosity. Finally, the moment came. The presenter, a slick local news anchor, began the gushing introduction for the humanitarian of the year. A man whose generosity knows no bounds, a titan of industry with the heart of a poet, whose commitment to our community is an inspiration to us all. Please welcome Mr. Julian Thorne. Thorne strode to the stage amidst thunderous, manufactured applause, a predatory smile plastered on his face. He accepted the heavy crystal award, holding it up for the flashing cameras. Thank you, he began, his voice dripping with false humility. I am truly humbled. You know, people like me, we have a duty. Giving back is not a choice. It is an obligation. The Saint. Jude's foundation is about one thing, and one thing only: lifting people up. That's our cue, Arthur whispered to Alara. As Thorne continued his self-aggrandizing, nauseating speech, Arthur Pendleton walked calmly onto the stage from the opposite side. A confused murmur went through the crowd. The reclusive founder of Serafina was a legend. His appearance at any event was a major news story in itself. Thorne stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in confusion, and a flicker of irritation at being upstaged. Arthur, he said, forcing a smile, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming. I'm full of surprises tonight, Julian, Arthur said, his voice amplified by the microphone he took from the podium. The friendly, avuncular tone was gone, replaced by cold, hard steel. I'm afraid I have to interrupt this charade. You see, while you've been busy lifting people up, you've also been quite busy emptying their pockets to line your own. On cue, as if by magic, the massive screens on either side of the stage, which had been showing a smiling, airbrushed photo of Thorne, flickered and changed. An image of Davy's shadow ledger appeared, open to a page detailing fraudulent transactions, the numbers stark and undeniable. Then, a complex flowchart showing money moving from Panamanian shell corporations into the Foundation's accounts, and then out to a holding company Thorne used for acquisitions. Then, direct quotes from the audio files on the pen drive, displayed in stark white text against a black background. The Foundation is the perfect washing machine. The ballroom fell into a dead, shocked silence, broken only by the frantic, hungry clicking of press cameras. Thorne's face went from tanned and confident to a ghastly, waxy pale. This is absurd. It's slander. My lawyers will be in touch. This is a fabrication. Your lawyers are welcome to examine the evidence, which has already been delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Arthur cut in smoothly, his voice like chipping ice. Evidence that includes the full, unencrypted Lazarus file. We have your shell corporations, Julian. We have your offshore accounts. We have sworn testimony from the staff you've been blackmailing and coercing for years. He gestured to the wings. Alara stepped forward into the hard, bright spotlight. Her eyes found Thorne's across the stage. There was no fear in her gaze, no trembling. There was only a calm, searing, righteous judgment. And you have me, she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a power she never knew she possessed, a power that filled the silent hall. I'm the waitress you tried to fire for not responding to the snap of your fingers. You thought I was nothing, a ghost. But I was listening. I was watching. And when you got angry and careless, you dropped this. She held up the sleek black pen for all to see, the small object gleaming under the lights. You dropped the keys to your entire corrupt kingdom. It was the ultimate, devastating showdown, not in a boardroom, but in the full glare of the society he had worked so hard to conquer and impress. The men and women in tailored suits and expensive gowns, who had been fawning over him moments before, now stared, their faces masks of shock and dawning horror. The federal agents began to move quietly, but purposefully, through the crowd, their expressions grim and professional. Thorne stared at Alara, his brilliant, corrupt mind finally connecting the dots in a blinding flash of realization. The insignificant waitress, the missing pen, the public humiliation. It was all her. This ghost in a uniform had orchestrated his utter annihilation. A guttural, inhuman sound of pure, frustrated rage escaped his throat. His mask of civilization was stripped away completely, revealing the feral, cornered beast beneath. He lunged, not at the old man who was his peer, but at her, the symbol of his undoing. But he never reached her. Two of the guests, a man and a woman in formal wear, intercepted him, moving with a speed and efficiency that was anything but philanthropic. They pinned his arms behind his back with practiced, painful force. And for the first time, Julian Thorne looked exactly like what he was, a common, violent criminal, caught and cornered. As they led him off the stage, his empire crumbling around him in real time, his final desperate gaze fell on Alara. In her eyes, he saw no triumph, no gloating, no pleasure. He saw only a quiet, profound, and impersonal justice. The waitress hadn't just snapped his ego in half. She had shattered the very foundation of his world, using the pieces of the life he had so carelessly tried to break. Near the kitchens, mister. Davies was quietly apprehended, having fainted at the sight of his own handwriting on the giant screen. The house of cards had fallen, swept away by a hurricane no one had seen coming. In the ensuing months, the fallout was biblical. The Thorne-Serafina scandal dominated the news cycle, a modern-day morality play about hubris and its downfall that captivated a nation weary of corporate impunity. Julian Thorne and his network of accomplices, including a very talkative Mr. Davies, were buried under an avalanche of federal charges ranging from wire fraud and money laundering to racketeering. The Lazarus file, once decrypted, proved to be a Pandora's box that brought down not just his operation, but a dozen corrupt city officials and corporate partners with it. The Saint. Jude's foundation was dissolved, its legitimate assets seized, and properly transferred to the Children's Hospital. The Serafina Grand, under Arthur Pendleton's direct and reinvigorated leadership, underwent a radical, painful, but necessary transformation. The corrupt were purged, and the honest, like Maria and Chef Antoine, were promoted, celebrated, and rewarded. A new culture of respect and integrity was instituted from the ground up, with employee profit-sharing programs and transparent accounting. Alara Vance never wore a waitress uniform again. Arthur, true to his word and beyond, offered her a choice. He would pay for her to finish her art history degree at Columbia, a full, all-expenses-paid ride, no strings attached. Or she could accept a newly created executive position, Director of Corporate Aesthetics and Employee Relations for the entire Serafina Hospitality Group. Your eye for detail is unparalleled, my dear, he had told her over a quiet lunch a week after the gala. you don't just see objects. You see people. You see the truth behind the facade. I don't want you serving my guests anymore. I want you shaping the very experience they have, ensuring that every corner of my hotels, from the staff locker rooms to the presidential suites, reflects the dignity and integrity you showed on that stage. She took the job. 6 months later, Elara stood in the newly renovated lobby of the Serafina Grand. The oppressive, cold opulence of Thorne's preferred style was gone, replaced by a warm, inviting design infused with natural light, comfortable seating, and most importantly, walls filled with stunning works from up-and-coming local artists she had personally curated. She was no longer a ghost. She was a creator, a presence. She wore a stylish blazer, her bearing confident, her eyes bright, with a purpose she had thought long dead. Tucked under her collar, she still wore the silver locket, not as a reminder of loss, but as a touchstone of her own resilience and strength. Across the lobby, she saw a young waiter, his face flush with nervousness, being berated by a wealthy, impatient guest who was tapping his ridiculously expensive Patek Philippe watch. The guest was puffing up his chest, preparing to raise his voice, to make a scene, to assert his status through intimidation. It was a scene she had witnessed and endured 1,000 times. Before he could, Elara crossed the floor with a calm, purposeful stride. She didn't confront the guest directly. She came to stand beside the young waiter and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on his arm. Then she smiled warmly at the irate man. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice calm and imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "My name is Elara Vance. I'm one of the directors here. It seems we're having a small issue, and for that, I apologize. Why don't you let me handle it personally? And we'll have your preferred table ready in just a moment. In the meantime, the first bottle of champagne is, of course, on us." The guest, disarmed by her poise, the unexpected offer, and the quiet power she projected, found his anger deflating like a punctured tire. He nodded, suddenly placated and slightly embarrassed. Elara gave the young waiter's arm a gentle squeeze. "You're doing a great job," she whispered to him, so only he could hear. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. Not here. Not anymore." She watched him walk away toward the service station, his shoulders a little straighter, his head held a little higher. In that small, quiet moment, she understood the true nature of power. It wasn't in the snap of a finger or the size of a bank account. It was in the quiet, consistent ability to restore someone else's dignity, to champion the unseen, and to build a foundation of respect so solid that it could withstand the arrogance of the world. Her faith, not in the flawed systems of man, but in the profound power of a single individual's integrity to reform them, was not just restored. It was forged anew in the fires she had walked through, stronger, purer, and more brilliant than ever before.